Oh, you do the volume, right? It's not loud enough. Oh, but it's not loud enough. Okay. Started the recording. All right. Here we go.
Noise, trim it.
Okay. Oh, that's going to be better. Good afternoon, Ponders. Today is Monday, June 1st, and it is my pleasure today for the Meet Your Neighbor segment to introduce Bill Tuel. He and his wife, Betsy, moved into the North Wing in July of last year, coming from Rosendale. And Bill has an interesting background, and I'm going to turn it over to him to tell you all about it.
Thank you, Halema. I think everybody has an interesting background, but they're all different and they're all worth hearing about. My parents are from the Midwest. My dad is from northern Minnesota, and there's a small world story with Mary Louise Van Winkle that I'll relate at the end of this hour if I can. And my mother was from southern Illinois, and they met in Indianapolis, Indiana. And the thing that attracted my mother to my dad was that he had a shiny new car and gave her rides to church. And they were married within 6 months, and they were married 60 years. So I came along just before World War II started for the US. And just after I came along, my parents moved to Buffalo, where they lived most of their lives, with some intervening trips to West Virginia, Ohio, New Jersey, as my dad had various jobs working for his company. His Ohio stint was in Ashtabula, which is right on the shore of Lake Erie. And so I got to swim in Lake Erie every day in the summer. It was cold even then. But I ended up going to high school in New Jersey, and from there went to college at RPI in Troy. Troy had, of course, a women's college, Russell Sage, and a church that invited students from both Russell Sage and RPI to come and have a coffee hour. And there I met this handsome, beautiful young lady, Betsy, and eventually convinced her to marry me, which we did just after she graduated from Russell Sage. She got her PhD, that's putting hubby through, while I finished my graduate degree. And after I got my PhD, I got hired by IBM to work out on the West Coast. And so we hopped in a car and drove out to the West Coast and spent a number of years in San Jose, California. When you got there, it was time to start a family, and our daughter Beverly came along right away. And then a couple of years later, our son Clifford, and they're both, of course, adults now and well established in their own lives. Clifford lives in San Jose and works in software, and Beverly is a PhD marriage counselor in Denver, Colorado. And the other part of being a new family is to find a house. And so we watched a house being built, a tract house that we lived in for the rest of the time we were in California, which amounted to a total of 27 years. But there was an intervening year, which was interesting. I was working in my yard getting the landscaping in, and my manager called up from IBM and said, "How would you like to spend a year in Sweden?" And I said, "Oh, that's cold." And he says, "No, actually, it's quite pleasant. And we have somebody that wants to come to the United States from Sweden and go to a site in Missouri, and they want you to take his place." So I said, "Sure, I can do that." So we spent a year in Sweden watching as they switched from driving on the left to driving on the right, which was an interesting experience. And Beverly learned to walk there, and we learned a little bit of Swedish. We never did get the melody right. And so people were always asking us, Do you speak English?
Oh, I'd rather have the English. Did you have to drive a Volvo?
So we picked up a Volvo at the factory and drove it across Sweden the first day when we got there, uh, because there was no hotel for us in Göteborg where the factory was. And that was on the left, but we managed and then watched, as I said, it switch over to the right, and it was much more comfortable driving on the right-hand side of the road, as you can imagine.
Mm. Okay, so when you came back to San Jose, how long was it before you were transferred east?
Right. So this was in the late 60s, and I worked in San Jose until 76, and then up in Palo Alto in an office that overlooked Stanford University,
Mm.
and worked there until 92, when IBM, in its infinite wisdom, as I say, closed the center and sent us all looking for jobs. I was fortunate enough to manage a transfer to the East Coast to a group that I had worked with previously in Kingston, of all places, doing geographic information systems. But unfortunately, about 6 weeks after I got there, they closed that
Oh.
project down, justifiably. And I moved over to work on supercomputers and worked on supercomputers, including the fastest computers in the world, for the next 15 or so years until I retired.
That was in Poughkeepsie?
Well, that was in Kingston for 3 years until they closed that,
Right.
and then Poughkeepsie, right.
Mhm.
I had been a co-op student at RPI, and I had an assignment in Kingston in 1960. And there were rumors that Kingston site was going to close in 1960.
Took a while.
So when I got there in 92, I said, nah, they're just rumors. But of course, this time they were true.
Okay. So, and that's when you moved to Rosendale?
So we moved to Rosendale. Within that time, it actually was about the same distance to work as when I lived in the town of Ulster.
Okay. And you retired when?
So I retired in 2008 and went back to work for a couple of years as a consultant, and finally walked out of the IBM door at the end of 2011.
Oh,
And since then, I've been a free agent, if you will, but had opportunity then to do a lot more interesting things.
well, one of the things I know you do is you've been teaching at the LLI at Bard.
Right. So shortly after I retired, Betsy was already in the Lifetime Learning Institute at Bard College, which at the time was closer because we lived in the town of Ulster. And she got me involved first by teaching a class on how computers work. And since then, I've taught various other computers in the history of science, various other courses in the history of science. And I'm also involved in, right now, learning how Zoom works so we can do online courses this summer at Bard LLI.
Wonderful. Now, I know also that for years you've been involved with the AARP tax aid program as a trainer.
Right. So AARP has a program called Tax Aid that provides free income tax preparation for principally aimed at seniors and low-income people. And I got involved in it sort of in a fluke, but have been involved in it for about 9 years now. Although this last year we had to suspend and close early because we could no longer meet our clients in person. But I started being a counselor preparing returns, and after a couple of years was able to become an instructor in teaching the other counselors. There's about 25 of us in Ulster County, and that's fun. And I've actually done some around here for people that would have normally gone to the St. Joseph site, but couldn't get there because of the virus.
I'll vouch to that. Before you moved here, we had 2 apartments dedicated to the phone center for tax aid. But then they needed the apartments and we had no other place to work. But it was a worthwhile project. Helps a lot of people.
Right. We're hoping to be able to do it again. And maybe it'll be a different set of options, and maybe we'll be able to do things in some sort of remote way. But that's, everybody is scrambling right now to figure out what makes sense.
Oh, yeah. And personal taxes moved up till July 15th now?
Right. The tax deadline, filing deadline is July 15th.
Mm.
And if you're going to get a refund, there's actually no penalty for not filing for 3 years. So, you know, that's a good idea, good reason for having a refund coming.
Someone asked me recently if the tax incentive checks that were issued last month, up to $1,200, if they were taxable, but I didn't know.
They are not taxable.
Oh.
They're a tax refund. They will be accounted for on your income taxes next year, but that will be an additional entitlement that you'll get. And so you shouldn't have to pay taxes on those.
Hmm.
And the state doesn't tax anything for the federal government, so you're safe there too.
Oh, are the people that are getting unemployment checks, is that taxable?
Now, unemployment is taxable,
is
both
taxable.
the federal and the state level.
Yeah.
And it's important to have that data when you're filing your return, because the state doesn't send out anything. You have to go online to get it,
Oh, you have to.
which is a nuisance for a lot of people.
Not going to be easy. No. Now, I know from you and Betsy coming to the 7:30 coffee clutch every morning before we were shut down, that you have a love of a variety of musical styles. So if you would talk about that.
I've been playing trombone and what's called the baritone horn, otherwise known as the euphonium, almost all my life. My dad was a trombone player, and in the band at his small town in northern Minnesota, and taught me to play when I was in grade school. And I've been playing lower brass instruments ever since. When I came here in '93, Tom Keene was organizing the concert band at Ulster County Community College. And there was an article about that in the paper. And my wife said, Betsy said, "Oh, look at that, they're forming a band. You ought to go try out." And I did, and I stayed. So I've been in that band for 25 years,
Wow.
but I'm afraid that it's not going to last very long, because right now we had about, last rehearsal, we had about 60 musicians in a small room practicing and trying to figure out how to do that with social distancing.
Very hard.
Will be tricky.
It sounds like your wife Betsy is a good scout. She got you into LLI. She got you into the band. Maybe she got you to Woodland Pond. I don't know.
Well, it was certainly on our radar, and actually she got me into AARP taxes, because we went to a birthday party of a childhood friend of hers and met somebody who was doing it, who convinced me to do it. So yes, she looks out for me and gets me into a lot of interesting things.
Now, you also sing in a group, don't you?
I sing in Pondoliers, if we can ever start that up again. And then when I came here, I joined a group called Ulster Choral Society that was singing classical music and spring concerts with an orchestra. Bill Woltz, who now lives here, was also in that group. And for a while, Denora, our Pondolier director, was also in the group as a high school student. So it's a nice local group, and there are a lot of fun connections there, and we had a good time.
Nice.
Before we leave music, I wanted to say one other thing that has been very pleasurable for me is to participate in an activity called Tuba Christmas. Tuba Christmas is where all the tuba players in the area get together and play 4-part Christmas carols. The mothership, if you will, is a group of about 300 people that play on the ice on the ice rink at Rockefeller Center just before Christmas.
Wow. I think I may have seen them once.
It's on YouTube.
It's quite a
And-
sound when they all get together.
Right, and we don't have that many here, but we do have about 25 or 30 tuba players or tenor tubas, and the baritone horn counts as a tenor tuba. And I'd like to show off the thing that I bring as a unique instrument.
Oh, please do. Oh, that looks so heavy.
So this is what's called a double bell euphonium. It has obviously two bells, this one and this one. They don't play at the same time. There's a valve that switches from one to the other. And the idea is in a small group where you want to have a brighter sound, like a herald trumpet or something like that, you can enable this bell. And the other one, of course, is a regular euphonium sound. So I'll demonstrate. That was the regular bell. And so sometimes in the Christmas carols we play that there's a writer's part, and then I do this. And otherwise it's a regular euphonium. So this is a fun thing to do, but this horn only comes out about once a year for that, because other than that, it's really doesn't play in tune very well. And I don't think it's just me.
Didn't I see a picture of you on your terrace when the employees were marching across the campus and we were applauding them for all the work that they did? Did you play that from the deck?
Right. So I know I have another euphonium that's on loan from the school.
Oh,
It's a larger instrument. It's much heavier. It's the same general sound, but it's only a single bell. And when I heard all of the noise outside for the staff, I said, "Oh, I can join that, make that noise." And it's not exactly like a fanfare trumpet, but I think they enjoyed it.
it was fun. They
So
did.
that was good.
They did.
And I'm afraid I'm going to have to give that one back, because if they close the music program, they're going to want all their instruments back. So, but it's been a good run.
25 years. Yeah. So, let's see. You were just getting into things here at Woodland Pond, you and Betsy, when, well, 6 or 7 months or so when the shutdown occurred. You have any thoughts about what you'd like to get involved in when it's over?
Well, I think I'd like to go back and have a coffee clutch. And I'd like to go back to Bandoliers if we can figure out how to do it. I'm beyond that, and I always expected to at least spend some time in the pool, although I'm not a swimmer particularly. But I grew up actually hating the water, even though my grandparents of northern Minnesota had a log cabin, summer cabin on a lake that we could swim in, and my grandparents fished in and so on. But it was always very cold, and I never did want to get my head under the water. So it took me a while to learn to swim.
If
I
I'm
thought
not,
I'd get back to it.
don't dive in now, because when I passed by and saw all the water is drained from it, it was a
I
little
saw that.
off-putting.
Yeah.
You and Betsy talk about, you do a lot of day tripping. I know the Hudson River Museum, you're members of that, and you do other local sites around. Any favorite places?
It's not, there's a lot of places that are really beautiful. We enjoy going up to Mohonk and, walking through the grounds. And we have not stayed overnight there yet. We were thinking of doing that, but I think that's another postponement.
Yeah, they're opening in 2 weeks.
Right, maybe we'll figure out, do we have to isolate if we come back here from Mohonk? Probably.
Oh.
But we're in a lot of the local organizations, the Maritime Museum. We have season tickets for the Bardavon, Hudson Valley Philharmonic, and for the Metropolitan Opera,
Oh,
all
yes.
of which have been converted into donations. So, but maybe that we'll see. It's
We'll
hard to
see.
know.
We'll see what startup. I know was it 2 or 3 years ago that the Mountain House had to close because of a neurovirus, and they established many new protocols. I imagine the same thing will happen now when they reopen um, for
You know,
safety.
I had forgotten about, I had heard about it at the time, but I had forgotten about that. But I think the need for social distancing is, I think, the most inhibiting aspect
be
of,
hard.
of anything like that, or certainly at the Bardavon or Ulster or UPAC, or even in college classes, because they're built on the premise of having a bunch of people together, and that's going to be tough.
Yeah. Did some of the subscriptions you mentioned, is that what they asked people to do, to turn those into donations?
Yes, we got letters from the Bardavon saying, would you mind? And
Hmm.
they would have, and they're also doing the Bard Summerscape, and the Bard Music Festival is postponed a year.
I saw that.
And they're hoping people will just hold on to their quote tickets, unquote, their vouchers, and come back next year.
Yeah.
But they'll also refund money too. But this year we had not planned to go, so that's just as well.
Big adjustments for all the arts
Mm.
and restaurants and people. It's
Yeah,
been,
and we do like to eat out
seismic.
a lot.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll count on you for restaurant recommendations when they open up. See which ones are open, which ones are better.
Right. Actually, one of the recommendations was a little bit in reverse. We went down to Ship Lantern Inn down in Marlborough for Restaurant Week last May, the day before we were going to come to here for a marketing luncheon. And the next table, there were people talking, and we finally realized that they were talking about Woodland Pond.
Oh,
And we said, oh, we've heard about Woodland Pond. We're going to marketing lunch tomorrow. Turned out to be Tom and Carol Natoli.
oh, for heaven's sake.
So when we got here and they were hosts, they said, oh, guess who's here?
Yeah.
So yes, recommendations.
I remember at one breakfast, Betsy was showing pictures. You had gone to a concert along the Hudson, a summer concert, and you said to Betsy, look who's sitting in front of us. Do you remember? It was Bill and Hillary.
Oh, yes. So we went to, not in front of us, but in the same audience. That was at Boscobel, the Hudson
Boscobel.
Valley Shakespeare Festival. And we went to a performance. And just before the curtain opened, I mean, not really a curtain, but just before the show started, I noticed that everybody was sort of looking over in one entrance and standing up and recognized it as Bill and Hillary and 4 Secret Service agents and a few other people around. And Betsy, I was too uncool to go over, but Betsy went over and shook their hands and
Yep.
and commiserated with Hillary and so on.
And had
And that
the
was,
cell phone picture to prove it.
yeah, and this is of course after the election, so
Okay,
but it was fun.
yeah. We have about 2 more minutes. Is there anything else that you think residents would like to know about you?
Well, let's go back and talk about this small world story.
Oh, yes.
So since I enjoy concerts, I really enjoy taking the bus. And so I took the bus to the Newburgh Symphony concert and came back, and I overheard somebody in the opposite aisle talking about northern Minnesota. And so I perked up my ears because my father is from there, and it's not a large area, large geographically, but not large population. Lake Wobegon to the exception. And so I met her, and it was Mary Louise Van Winkle. And I asked her where she was from. and she said grew up in a little town called Coleraine. Coleraine is a mining town, and for iron ore mining, and it was the same town that my dad grew up in. In fact, later on, I discovered that Mary Louise and my dad went to the same high school, a generation apart. But more interestingly was that her dad was the superintendent of the iron mine, and my grandfather was a supervising chemist in the lab. And that I happened to have a picture of her father awarding a service medal to my grandfather that I was able to share with her. She'd never seen that.
Wonderful.
And it's just an amazing small world.
And Bill produced the short video a few weeks ago that was shown here about the mining town, what it was then and what it looks like now.
Yeah. And that was fun. And yeah. I'm glad to have been able to have that experience and also to be able to produce a video like that.
Yes, thank you. That was quite a meeting. So I think we can conclude our chat. I'm really delighted.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad to be able to meet lots of interesting people at Woodland Pond, and hope to be an interesting person myself.
Oh,
and
yeah, sure.
Once we get masks off, so I can
Oh,
recognize people again.
It's hard to get to know somebody wearing a mask.
Right.
I'd just like to say to the residents that this feature once a week, I've been interviewing people that have not been written up in the newsletter, that are relatively new. And if I haven't gotten around to you yet, watch out. I'll be there. Have a good afternoon, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad you brought
Yeah, I figured that would be.
There's a lot of science that goes.
I'm sorry?
There's a lot of science that goes into designing that. Isn't there?
Science and a lot of just experience.
Okay.